Hey everybody, welcome to our Maundy Thursday service. You're going to need a couple things before we get started, so I'm going to give you two amazing songs that Jennifer and the band put together. Here's what you're going to need. It's not too complicated, but you're going to need some kind of juice. If you got grape juice, that's preferred because that's the actual, the blood of the grape is what we're talking about with that First Communion experience. If you need to use wine, uh, grab yourself some of Napa Valley's finest, and then get a piece of bread, or I've got some crackers here. And you can either get a big enough cracker that you can take a couple bites out of, because I'm going to have us do this in two parts. You're going to actually take communion twice. So you either need enough drink to sip on it a little bit and then some more later. And same deal with a cracker. Either have two crackers or eat enough of one first and then more later, because we'll get to that in a moment. But you got two songs starting right about now to go get this stuff together if you don't already. And if you already got it together, just put it in front of you and enjoy these two songs, because I think you're really going to like them. All right, here we go.
I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. You say I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I think I am weak. You say I am held when I outside looking in. That's where grace begins. We were hungry, we were thirsty, with nothing left to give. Oh, the shape that we were in. And just when all hope seemed lost, love opened the door for us. He said, come to the table. Come join the sinners who've been redeemed. Take your place beside the Savior. Sit down and be set free. Come to the table. Come to the table. Come meet this motley crew of misfits, these liars and these thieves. There's no one unwelcome here. And that sin and shame that you brought with you, you can leave it at the door. Let mercy draw you near. He said, come to the table. Come join the sinners who've been redeemed. Take your place beside the Savior. Sit down and be set free. Come to the table. Come to the table. To the thief and the doubter, to the hero and the coward, to the prisoner, to the soldier, to the young and to the older, all who hunger, all who thirst, all the lasts and all the first, all the paupers and the princess, all who fail, you've been forgiven, all who dream, all who suffer, all who loved and lost another, all the chained and all the free, all who follow, all who lead, anyone who's been let down, all the lost who have been found, all who have been labeled right or wrong. To everyone who hears this song, he said, come to the table. Come join the sinners who've been redeemed. Take your place beside the Savior. Sit down and be set free. Sit down and be set free. Come to the table. Come to the table. Come to the table.
So this night we call it Maundy Thursday, and that word Maundy is not Monday and not mispronouncing anything. It comes from the root word that we get the word mandate from. And this was likely a Passover dinner. There's some ongoing academic debate over, was this Passover dinner or was this not Passover dinner? And, I just got a recent insight from my friend Niles Goldstein, who's the rabbi here of Congregation Beth Shalom in Napa. And he was describing to a recent group of people that were together on a Zoom call that Passover started for the Jewish tradition last night, Wednesday night, and continues on to this night. And he said that it's not uncommon for people to celebrate a family Passover Seder on Wednesday night, in this case, this week, Wednesday night this week, and then together with the community of faith on Thursday night. So maybe that's what we've got here. Maybe this is a way to think about this in order to still make this the Passover meal that Jesus experienced with his disciples. And this was a huge festive occasion. I mean, you know, Jerusalem normally was a large city for its day in Israel. But when this was happening, it's like a work day in San Francisco. Overnight, you have half as many people in San Francisco as you do the very next morning. It literally doubles in size. And I want you to imagine that. And everybody's coming together with great festivity. Last Sunday, I talked about what that entry must have been like for Jesus as he came into town. And his disciples and his followers had one idea of what they thought was going to be, but I don't think Jesus ever really had their idea in mind as he came into the city. I think he knew that he was coming into enemy territory and that this week was not going to end well. But nonetheless, here they are having their Passover meal together. And one of the strange things happens during this meal, probably because there was such a demand on it. But the disciples couldn't get a foot washer to come. This was usually a job for a slave or a hired hand, usually Gentile, if you could do that. And they would come in and wash everybody's feet before you would recline with everybody else and have this meal together because, they wore sandals. There's a lot of camel and goat and sheep stuff on the road. And this stuff was caked on their feet, no doubt. And who wants to eat next to that or eat that? So anyway, they didn't have a foot washer, and so you had all these stinky, grimy, caked feet sitting around with all this food, and Jesus looking around, recognizing nobody's going to bend, nobody's going to, lift a finger. So he decides to make this a teaching moment. So he gets up from the table, wraps a towel around himself, and proceeds to wash the feet of all the disciples, much to their chagrin. Peter is one that actually remarked on it, was like, "You're not going to do this to me." And well, that was one of these put your foot in your mouth kind of moments for Peter, because Jesus basically said, "You got to let me serve you or you'll have no part of me." And so this became a teaching moment where Jesus said, "You call me master. And if I'm your master, it means that you as my disciples, my followers, do what I do. That's what it means to follow me. And so as you have seen me do this, you must go and serve likewise." And he goes on and talks about how the love for one another in this discipleship community was what was going to indicate to the rest of the world that they really were his followers. The key thing that was going to represent whether or not they were the true disciples of Jesus was their love for one another. And by extension, their love for the world. Isn't that interesting? That it's the love. It's not this firm belief statement. It's not an airtight theology that's going to indicate to the rest of the world who the true Jesus followers is. It's love. Bottom line, it's love. And in this supper, it's love expressed through washing crap-caked feet. And so you had a lot of people around this table. I love that song that Jennifer just offered, "Come to the Table," because it's so inclusive. Everybody is welcome at this table. And at this table that night so long ago, the mood, if you're wondering about, well, what was this like? I want you to think kind of a hybrid between Thanksgiving and July 4th. Thanksgiving because that's what this was about. They were together. They were remembering their time together that they've had over the last few years. But it was kind of like July 4th for Americans, that this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't like July 4th, they signed the Declaration of Independence, and July 5th, we were a country. No, July 4th was the beginning. That was the Declaration of Independence, that we were going to do this new thing. And so there was kind of an excitement and anticipation about that combined with this Thanksgiving, and not just for this moment in particular, but in the Jewish context, they're remembering in Passover, they're remembering that they were once, imprisoned. They were in slavery in Egypt. And through the power of God, working through many different agencies, they experienced the Exodus from that kind of experience in Egypt all the way to the Promised Land. And so this was not just their own personal Thanksgiving, but a deeply reflected historical Thanksgiving as well. And as they're marching to what they think is going to be a new day, and it was not quite what they thought, it was like it was like July 4th for us in America, where this was going to be a new day dawning. They just didn't know exactly what that day was going to look like. And so when we take this communion, the first part that I want you to remember with the disciples in view is just imagine ourselves around the table with Jesus. Imagine you as a person of faith. And I want you just to reflect for a moment how you've experienced the truth of faith in your life. How has the way of Jesus impacted you? How has God met you where you are? How has God been a source of hope, healing, direction, comfort, whatever that is for you? How would you express that just now? And I just want to have you take a moment of silence, and we'll think together about what this meal means for us. If we were to go around the room together at Crosswalk and make you do this around tables like we do on Sunday, and you had to express, okay, well, this is how I'm thankful to God today for how God has been there, what would you say? Because that's the kind of thing that would have been happening around the table as they're remembering together their journey with Jesus up to this point. So take just a moment, pause, and reflect on what does this moment mean for you today, here and now? What are you grateful for in terms of your faith in God? Okay, so as we come back, I want you to grab your glass and grab your cracker. I want you to recognize that the primary thing that Jesus first told his disciples is that when they took the bread and the cup, that they would simply remember him. And part of the remembering and the celebrating is just to be cognizant and aware of how God has been faithful to us in so many different ways. I'm just asking you to come up with one tonight. And that one tonight may be, for me, it's hope. It's that especially right now as we're going through COVID-19, it's that there's something bigger than COVID-19 at work in the world, and it's the presence of God. And God has been there for me personally in this day and in this season, and that's not going to change going forward. So I'm grateful that God is faithful to bring hope in a very troubled world. So what is it for you? If you can say it out loud, it just makes it stronger. And if you're with others, then take a moment and say it together. Take turns. I'll give you a second just to do that, so you literally say it out loud, because that's good for your brain and good for your body. So say it out loud, and then I'll lead you through the first chunk of communion. Go for it. Okay. So in remembrance of all the ways that God has been there for us, we take and eat the bread. That bread that you taste in your mouth reminds us of the body of Christ, that he was a real flesh and blood human being. Just like us, he had flesh and blood. Which brings us to the cup. Now, he had a little more going on than just plain old blood in him. He had the very Spirit of God at work in his veins coursing through. That channeled through him. He was a conduit like no other that we've seen quite before. And he was able to do incredible things that only God can do because God's Spirit was flowing through him like blood courses through our veins. And so, in like manner, in recognition of the ways that God has been good to us, we take and drink. And we're grateful because God has been with us that God and Jesus took on flesh and blood, moved into the neighborhood. And that's instructive for us. And we've been impacted by it ever since. But we have the luxury of time behind us and with us that the disciples really couldn't afford at that first Passover. They went away from that dinner back to their camp at the Garden of Gethsemane, and they fell asleep, even though they were asked to pray all night. They fell asleep with full bellies, probably because they had full bellies, and were filled with thanksgiving for what God had done in their midst. They had no idea what was about to hit them just a couple hours later. Jesus had a hunch. I don't know that he knew exactly how bad it was going to get, but it went bad quick. As you recall, at that Last Supper, he was betrayed by Judas, one of his disciples, who left that dinner to go tell the chief priests and their guards where to find Jesus at the camp at the garden. And they showed up, and they had a sign to let the chief priests know who Jesus was, because it was dark and they didn't really know what he looked like all that much. And so he kissed him on the cheek. That identified Jesus for who he was. And that led to a night and day of hell for Jesus. He was arrested. He was put on a mock trial. It was real as far as they were concerned, the chief priests and the religious leaders of that day. But it wasn't legit. They didn't have the representation there that was supposed to be there. It was under cover of night. There were so many things wrong with it. But they went for it anyway. And the very next day, they took him before Roman authorities, kind of hopped him around court to court. And he ended up right in front of Pilate in Jerusalem. And Pilate decided, all right, that they want to beat this guy up, so we'll beat this guy up. So he sent him to be persecuted, and really, really badly, and then brought him back. And long story short, he got democratic and asked for people to decide who they wanted to be killed that day. A guy named Barabbas, an insurrectionist, or Jesus, who we would later learn was looked at as an insurrectionist himself. And the crowd, who probably was deeply influenced by the religious authorities of that day in Jerusalem, they chose Jesus, and that set Jesus off with a cross, where he would die just a couple hours later. Now, this is a really difficult thing, because when we think about bread and cup today, we get ourselves in a place where we're thankful and we're grateful. But sometimes we go too quickly to Easter, and we forget what these days, the Friday and the Saturday into Sunday morning, had to have been like for the disciples. So tonight's kind of a hybrid service. I wanted to take you through that Maundy Thursday and be grateful and thankful and remember Jesus that way. But I also wanted to take you into Good Friday. You know, one question that we might want to ask is, why in the world would anybody want to kill Jesus so bad? I mean, the guy was a super nice guy. He went around saying nice things about people and the goodness of God, and he was super inclusive in his theology and his language. It seemed like everybody loved this guy. So what gives? Why in the world would people want this guy dead? Well, as is the case in a lot of historical moments, we kill people when they threaten our power. We kill ideas when they threaten their power. And Jesus, with his teaching and with his inclusivity with people, and saying that God was inclusive as well, that was rubbing the religious authorities deeply wrong. They had a whole different system in mind and had crafted a system that kept them in power and also kept them at relative peace with Rome. See, the chief priests and the religious authorities of that day in Jerusalem had a charge. You keep the Jewish people in place. We will allow you to have authority over them, even to rule over them in legal affairs to a certain degree. You keep it all quiet, and we'll let you stay in power. But you blow it, and you're in big trouble. So they hear rumors of this guy named Jesus up in Galilee, which is a northern kind of bumpkin town, Israel, and hearing about this guy that's saying some wacky things, but God seems to be with him in some powerful ways, and so not quite sure what to do with this guy. But by the time he gets to Jerusalem, Jesus does not hold back any punches. In fact, he swings hard, and he calls it straight out at the religious authorities. He calls out their corruption, calls out their hypocrisy, calls them out for being the greedy people that they were, because they were. that infuriated Jesus. He himself was deeply poor. He was extremely poor, and most of the people he knew were extremely poor. And yet, the people who were at the top, the chief priests, the leaders of all things Jewish at that time, they lived large. They lived in large homes within the city walls of Jerusalem. They had fine robes. They ate well. They loved to be addressed with great respect. Their egos were as big as you can imagine. And so they did not misinterpret what Jesus was saying. And they recognized that Jesus was popular and that his words were maybe going to gain some traction. And so they needed to get rid of this guy to protect themselves. And it was not a hard sell to the Roman authorities. We have accounts of how Rome felt about these Jewish people. They didn't give a rip about these Jewish people. Sometimes we have this picture of the crucifixion scene, and in our minds, because of the way it's been literally painted and painted in our imaginations, you just got 3 crosses on a hill. And you've got Jesus and a couple thieves behind him who were probably insurrectionists, challenging the authority of Rome. But really, the historical narrative that we get about this time is that this means of execution was used liberally by the Roman government. There may have just been 3 in that little mound, but there could have been dozens, if not hundreds, of remnants of crosses lining the hills leading up to the city of Jerusalem. They executed people by crucifixion by the thousands. When Jesus got executed, it was just the 3 o'clock slot, really. So for them, if you're a Roman authority, if you're Pilate, and you hear these religious authorities come to you and say, this guy's done wrong, he's a threat to the peace, it's not going to take you very long to say, all right, no problem, 3 o'clock's open, got one more slot if you want to get in on that one. Because that's just how they felt about it. Rome didn't give a rip about some Jewish peasant from northern Israel who was from Bumpkin Land and didn't really have any, didn't have any war machine with them. So let's just get rid of him, get rid of the problem. And that's exactly what they intended to do. And that's exactly what they did. I want you to think about how you would have felt like this as a disciple. You're watching this go down the whole time. You're at a distance because you're fearing for your own life, but a couple disciples made it up pretty close. They saw what had happened with the religious leaders in that fake trial. From a distance, they saw what was happening in Jesus' life. They saw him get beaten. They saw him go before Pilate, and the question asked, which one is going to get killed today? And the whole time, they just had to be shaking their heads in absolute disbelief, just wondering when are we going to see the power of Jesus come alive? When are we going to see him do something to take the reins like we were hoping for all this time? They're looking at this whole scene as an incredible injustice. The whole world for them is turning upside down. What do they do with this? What do you do with it? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. And my guess is that if you look more like me, with white skin, blue eyes, and if you're more like me socioeconomically, which is right in the middle class, there are some injustices that you may not be aware of. But are you aware that right now, as some of us sit rather safely, easily honoring social distancing within our own homes, that there are tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who aren't in the same kind of position, who COVID-19 hits much more hard. When you are a person of less means, it means you're in a crowded home. It means if one person's sick, it's not long before the whole house is sick. It means you can't not be on top of each other. When things like this happen, it does not hit the world equally. It hits those who struggle more harder. We already know this in terms of access to healthcare. We know this in terms of how people of color are experiencing this harder. So for you today, who you are wondering, are there any injustices in the world, even though this is one that we have not wanted, we haven't seen coming. We're catching up with our response rate to this whole thing. Even this just shines a light on the injustice which has been with us in so many other ways for so long. And you've been experiencing this. Maybe for you, you've been doing everything right as far as you know, and yet you lost your job or your business is suffering, and you're just like, how do we make any sense of this? Your world is turned upside down, and maybe you're shaking your fist at heaven saying, where is the justice in this? And where is God in all of this? And it feels like it's just not fair. And you feel like things are dying around you because they are. The Good Friday services that will happen tomorrow are meant to help us come to grips with the pain and the suffering of Jesus. I want you to start tonight. Some of us in our COVID-19 place, we're doing the best we can to ignore the pain that we're going through. We're in deep denial. We're self-medicating with Netflix binging, maybe snacking on stuff that we normally wouldn't, drinking more than we normally would. And I'm wondering if you're doing any of that. I'm wondering if this is a time for you as we think about what Jesus went through, if maybe this is a time to actually come to grips with our own suffering personally, our own suffering in our households, in our communities, and even collective humanity. How are we suffering together? And instead of running away from it, actually looking right into it. And so I hope you will do that, because that's also part of what communion is about. It is a solidarity with the suffering of Jesus. And so I want to read you a passage of scripture, if I can get rid of Siri. There she goes. This comes from the Apostle Paul. This would have been decades after Jesus lived and died. And he writes to the church in Corinth. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 23. He says, "Let me go over with you again exactly what goes on in the Lord's Supper and why it is so centrally important. I received my instructions from the Master himself and passed them on to you. The Master, Jesus, on the night of his betrayal, took bread. Having given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body broken for you. Do this to remember me.' After supper, he did the same thing with the cup. 'This cup is my blood, my new covenant with you. Each time you drink this cup, remember me.' And what they're remembering by this point in time is the horrible reality of his suffering and death. That was part of the road that Jesus took. We're to remember the suffering." Paul goes on, "What you must solemnly realize is that every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, you reenact in your words and actions the death of the Master. You will be drawn back to this meal again and again until the Master returns. You must never let familiarity breed contempt." In other words, don't get so casual with this symbol, with this sacrament, that you forget what it's really about. Anyone who eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Master irreverently is like part of the crowd that jeered and spit on him at his death. Is that the kind of remembrance you want to be part of? Examine your motives, test your heart. Come to this meal in holy awe. And so we do. When we take communion this next round, as you crunch your cracker, eat the bread, I want you to remember the body of Jesus. I want you to know there's solidarity in knowing that he suffered deeply for what was right and what was good. That's shocking to us because sometimes we think that when we do the right thing, it means that good things are going to follow. Well, they might, but first there might be major backlash. And that backlash resulted in the persecution and execution of Jesus. And so when we take that cracker, we remember that this Jesus was willing to go as far as possible, laying his life on the line to communicate that God is a God of love, grace, and peace. He didn't lift a hand. He didn't fight back. It's as if his death itself and his persecution and execution itself is to say to the world, look at what you're capable of. Far beyond what would eventually be understood as substitutionary atonement, bloodshed to satisfy God's wrath or whatever. Way before that, Jesus is saying, just look at what the world is capable of. And the remedy to it is not to fight harder. The remedy to it is to approach even the most difficult suffering with the love of God and the grace and the peace that come with that. So first we remember the suffering of Jesus' body, the shedding of his blood, that it was real, it was awful, it was unjust, it was painful, it was death. But as we do, we also remember where we are ourselves. And we need to ask ourselves, where are we right now? What deaths are we facing? What suffering are we enduring? And to be honest about them. Some of you, your relationships are strained right now because of the stress you've been under. Be honest about it. Feel your feelings. Be aware of what is real. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't whitewash it. I'm going to bring you hope on Easter, okay? So hope is coming, but for now, just like the disciples, for good reason, own the suffering. Appreciate it. Feel it deeply, that it might have its power on you, not to defeat you, but that you would be honest about what is. And then finally, when we take this cracker, we remember not only Jesus' body, we remember not only our physical body and solidarity with Jesus and the cup, the blood that is shared, but we consider all humanity. And we lament and we mourn with those who have been so deeply impacted by this virus, those who have become terribly sick, those who've died, those who've had to mourn the loss of their loved ones at a distance. Horrific. So this bread and this cup now becomes deeply meaningful. It's a moment of sorrow. I don't have a happy song for you after this. Once we're done with this, we're just left with the taste of the bread, our shared solidarity in the brokenness of Jesus' body and our brokenness now. We're left with that in our mouth. And we're left with the taste of wine or grape juice that reminds us of shed blood, reminds us of Jesus' shed blood, reminds us of our own, reminds us of the shed blood going on all over humanity right now as we suffer together. And I ask for you to sit with the suffering until Easter. Easter's the day of hope. But Maundy Thursday into Good Friday and all day Saturday, this is a time where we lament, where we remember and we reflect on the pain that we're in. And for good reason, I hope you do. Let's take and eat the cracker. Jesus' broken body, our broken body, the world's broken body. We take the cup. We remember Jesus' blood. We remember our blood. We remember the shared blood of humanity as we suffer together. Take and drink. This is the way of Jesus. It's part of the way of Jesus. It's not to ignore or go around the suffering, but to go right through it. Because God will be with us. God will be with us. God will be with us. Let's end our time together with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I look forward to seeing you Sunday. Good night.